distant skies, firefight calls. The stakes are high, turn the flame, heroes and spies. Control fire, where strategy lies. Hear the tales, fierce and deep. Victors roar, defeated weep. We blaze a way, we don't hold back. Control fire, ready to attack.
Welcome everybody to your monthly musings on Mantic's Firefight. I am Mike.
I'm Luke.
I'm Sam, and this is Controlled Fire.
We're going to talk a little bit about the dark arts of wargaming, and I know Sam's pretty excited about this.
So this episode is about turn 0. I think turn 0 is probably the most important turn of the game. What is turn 0? Turn 0 is everything that goes into prepping for the game. So you've already done all your list building, you've rocked on up and you roll the mission. From then on, it's turn 0 until the player with initiative takes their first activation. So we're going to unpack everything that goes into turn 0 so that you can set up your games for success. Before we do, shall we jump into From the Forge?
Sure. I haven't really done much in the way of hobby per se, but I did run a smallish Dreadball tournament recently, which we had about 6 players with. So Sam must dominate the Brisbane scene because he also managed to win that particular tournament too that I set up. He pays me well, so it's good to see.
I was also challenged with that one that I had to play a team that couldn't foul. So I took the Adelarana. They are an honourable team. They can only break the laws of physics. They can't break the laws of Dreadball, but they managed to prevail on the day. It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much, Mike, for running. What about you, Luke?
So despite not being a Dreadball guy, the only real hobby I've done lately has been actually doing the trophy for that event. I knocked up a quick little Dreadball thing on a plinth for the trophy for that. I hope it turned out all right. It was kind of a bit slapdash and
it looks lovely on my shelf. Thank you.
Yeah, well, so I tried to get a model of an actual Dreadball, but the only ones you could get were like token sized, and I thought even scaled up they didn't work that well. So I just got some reference pictures and sculpted that from scratch in Blender. It didn't take that long. It was fun to do. Other than that, I'm just sort of more planning out Clash of Kings and Protocols and what I'm going to take to those because I need to get cracking on finishing out whatever I need for those armies.
That's very exciting. I also know that your Veermen that you've been working on and have been chatting about in From the Forge have started hitting the tables now as well.
Yeah, they're a heck of a lot of fun. They definitely play a bit differently to what I'm used to, so very fun to have those on the table and burrow up behind some opponents and ruin their day, so that's nice.
Excellent. For myself, I'm still working on my GCPS, but I'm also running the printer a bit hot right now, getting terrain together for Epic Warpath. So we know that that's going to be landing not exactly early in the new year, probably around May, June, but I want to make sure that when the game lands that I've got a table ready to put the forces down on. So printing a bunch of 10 mil size terrain, so I've got a table ready for Epic Warpath when it lands.
So you walk up to the table and you obviously introduce yourself, and maybe introduce your list, and you would then, of course, normally roll your mission. And then you're looking at the recon roll, which is very important to note because certainly as I deal with a lot of people who are relatively new to the game, they don't necessarily realise it's only the command dice that's been allocated to them by the commander. So there's a few units that also give command dice, and you don't get the 3 black dice that you originally start with. And you compare the score. If you've got a tie, you re-roll again. Once you actually have that result, the person who has actually won that roll, you can choose to hand that initiative over and let your opponent choose which edge and deploy first. Now, personally, I've never done that, and I've not had it done against me. So I was going to ask the question, have you guys ever handed over the initiative?
Frequently.
Yeah.
Because I think it's actually probably the first big decision of the game, because as you say, you take your recon roll, you roll it up, whoever has the highest can choose if they're going to hand over initiative, and the difference in scores is the number of units being withheld. Choosing whether or not you're holding initiative, you're kind of deciding on a few things. Do you want to have first activation in the game? Because there are some armies and builds where you absolutely want to act first, in which case you probably want to retain initiative. That aside, your decision is then, do you want to have your choice of the best terrain as it suits your army? Or do you want to have best knowledge of the opponent's deployment. And I think both of them come with their own advantages. Noting that, of course, it's a little bit mitigated by the difference in scores. So if I've rolled up particularly high in the difference, like if, say, I've got 4 higher, I'm then able to withhold 4 units and still retain initiative. I can then pick the terrain and still have a reasonable idea of what the opponent's deployment is going to be. I'm almost certainly going to be retaining initiative then. But otherwise, if it's only a very small difference, like the game I had last week, I'll hand it on. I would much rather see the opponent's deployment. I can sacrifice my knowledge of the terrain.
Yeah, I think all else being equal, if you win by 2 or more, I think it's generally better to go first. If you win by 1, probably let the other player go first. That one's not going to make a whole lot of difference in terms of like who's deploying where. Compared to some other games, as long as you don't have crazy, odd, strange tables, I don't really find that Firefight materially is that relevant of an advantage to have one side or the other, at least not on the tables that I've played. And I've played on all manner of tables that are just thrown out randomly or thoughtfully set up, and none of them really seem to have that material difference in sides and the advantage inferred, just because of the way the game moves around. I've never swapped sides when it's been my decision. Whatever side of the table that I'm staying on, even if I win the roll, I have never said I'll swap sides. And I do that frequently in Kings of War.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting. I mean, I very much do, and we'll look at it a little bit in what's involved in selecting a deployment zone if you are going to have that kind of decision. This is why I'd also advocate when people are setting up tables to make sure that they aren't truly symmetrical.
Yeah.
Because you not to say you want to have unbalanced tables, but if you've basically gone, we're going to have a mirror set up on either side, you're robbing someone of a decision there. And it basically means that they're then just going to go, well, in that case, I'll let you go first. I'll retain my information advantage of seeing your deployment. It's much better for there to be choices in terms of which side of the table I'm going to be on. And we'll chat about what's involved in selecting a deployment zone.
Yeah, there are certain advantages for certain armies, missions, and matchups that could be important. I just tend to find it's not as important as in some other games, because I think that the ability to have the last 2 or more drops is really, really, really good for counterplay. Like 1's fine too, but weighted against the side selection versus activation, that sort of stuff, it's not that big a deal. But 2 or more tends to enter the realms of I now can answer your deployment quite effectively.
That's right. What are the things that you look for? I know you say the thing you look for is, well, I'm standing on this side of the table, so I'm going to deploy over here. What are some of the things that you would look for? You mentioned you do it a bit differently in Kings.
Personally, like I said, I don't think it's a huge deal in this game, but some things to think about are when playing vehicles, it's pretty important to check where they can move. You don't want to have all your vehicles and go, oh, there's these obstacles in that terrain and it's going to be really hard now to get through there. So that's a consideration. There's also scenario or army-specific considerations like the ability to hide objectives behind terrain. If it's player-placed objectives, sometimes you want to go, well, this side's better because of just where this terrain or building is positioned. I can put a token right there. I can get to that and hold it very easily, and my opponent's going to have a really bad time trying to get it. Other things like, being able to leapfrog assault units through buildings and that sort of stuff to gain extra threat range can be quite handy if you're an assault army. And elite armies probably want to also keep an eye out for opportunities for a denied flank. They're not going to be able to cover as much board, so denying a flank effectively while using terrain can be a good strategy for them.
Absolutely, and we'll talk through denied flanks when we start talking about deployment formations and so on a little later in the episode. But yeah, absolutely, you should be looking at your terrain at the start. I'm really glad you mentioned the vehicle movement, and this is something that I did at BrizCon, was I actually got a choice of deployment zones, looked across at my opponent's army and the way the board looked, and I was like, well, if I pick this side, because of the size of Asterian vehicles, I know they've only got 2, across this entire 6-foot wide board, 2 viable paths forward. So I'm picking this side. I'm very happy to show you where I'm going, and I can put my anti-vehicle things right in front. I know where those vehicles are going to be because I've been able to read the board for it. Well, I mean, when I'm looking to pick a deployment zone, I guess I'm looking kind of for 3 things. I'm looking for open advanced lane, so this is what you were mentioning for vehicles, and also for other things where I don't really care about hiding, I just care about speed, and I want to make sure I have a straight line through there, so I'm thinking things like zombies and so on. Please shoot them, that's fine. Their shot's not going on other things. looking for obscured advanced lanes, and this is what you're mentioning, things like being able to leapfrog through buildings, or I'm going to move up to this point where I know I'm going to have parked an objective. Lanes where I know I can move through and be generally covered from return fire, and also fire lanes. So for the longer range weapons, places where I can park them, knowing they can have certain scopings over areas of the board. When I'm reading the deployment zone, I'm kind of looking at that for myself, and also what it would look like on the other side of the table. How are they going to be able to maneuver against me and fire at me? Particularly things that are going to be disrupting that, things which split open armies because there's big pockets of difficult terrain or blockable terrain which splits their force. Trying to build that in to make things as difficult as possible for them.
Generally with the two forces that I play, which is Forces and Forge Fathers, and mainly Forge Fathers, I very rarely, I can't even remember a time that I actually deployed first. I normally don't get that choice. And particularly when I was even playing Forge Fathers all the time, I was very used to going second. And so I never really had that choice for a deployment zone, so I've not really looked at it. What I do between those, how I deploy is a different matter, I guess, but the actual choosing a deployment zone, not normally a decision I get to make.
But how often do you find yourself thinking, I wish I had have got to choose that side?
I think originally I did, but as I said, originally I would do that, but I kind of, because I'm used to going second all the time, I got to the point where I just went, I'm not going to get that choice, I'm not going to worry about it anymore. I got more used to, I'm on the back foot in that regard, that choice isn't mine, this is what I'm going to be able to do. So, and work from it. So that's what I used to do. I just used to go, okay, you're going to set up first, you're going to choose the size, off you go, I'll wait.
I think the game is nicely designed in that you never feel particularly hard done by. You're either getting your choice of terrain or you're getting full information about the opponent's deployment. Neither of those are particularly bad options. It's just if you win, you get the choice of which of those options you have. Yes. And I guess it is worth thinking, because you mentioned Forge Fathers and Enforcers. We're talking smaller volumes of command. If the ability to select your terrain is, you think, particularly important to your army, then you may want to make sure you are including those command options. But I don't know if I've ever built a list with the idea of stacking a recon roll.
No.
I don't think, but I think some people take lots of commanders. I don't think they do it for that purpose.
They do it because there's other great things you can do with commanders.
Yes.
All right, so we were talking a little bit before about placing objectives and HVAs. How do we normally go about... Okay, so we've picked our deployment zone. Now the next thing that we normally do is place down objectives and HVAs. Sometimes the mission mandates exactly where they need to be, but when we have choices, how do we generally go about choosing where we place our objectives or HVAs?
Always in or behind cover where you can, using the terrain that we've just selected to our advantage to place these. If it has to be in the open, I say, and I find people not doing this, I measure incessantly when I place these things, because I always want things 6 or 12 inches from either cover or from where I know my units will be. So those are the two breakpoints, obviously, for a short action move or a sprint. So if I can say, well, if I put this here, turn 1, for example, I can move up behind this building and stay in cover. Turn 2, I can move out with a standard move and shoot. Or if this is, within 12 inches of my deployment zone, I can sprint onto it, or any of those sorts of movement options. Just knowing how many turns it's going to take you with what units to get to those points. And looking for those 6 and 12 inch breakpoints is where I go.
Although Veermen give you a little bit more leeway, being a little faster.
Some have 9, 15, some have different. So I say 6, 12 is just the standard, and Mike's probably rolling his eyes at his Forge Father speed 5, 10.
6, 12. That sounds ludicrously fast.
Blazingly fast.
Yeah, whiplash.
But so understanding your force and how fast they can move, and then using those breakpoints to help determine where you can put tokens is a good idea.
In there for talking about things, and unfortunately I lost both these two games. There's two particular examples. There's one where we were talking, Luke mentioned a little bit earlier about placing things behind terrain or in terrain. So I played a 1,000 point game against GCPS with my Forge Fathers, and that taught me a lesson in a different way, but I had the only units I could sit on those objectives was units of Steel Warriors, which were about 150 points each, which meant if I hit those two units, that was about 1/3 of my army going to be sitting there doing nothing. So I did put them into terrain, but the problem with that was the GCPS have these things called weapon teams, and and they can shoot straight across the other side of the table. And basically, it was controlled advance, which basically obliterated one of those 2 units of Steel Warriors sitting on there. So I was automatically going to be behind on scoring points in the progression of that particular game. So that kind of changed the way I started to design my list, and 60-point blocker units started to come into my list, because that's something I could then deploy into behind terrain, so it could be hidden, and I didn't mind losing 120 points at least to sit behind them. The other game was actually against Sam with the play game. We were playing Bodyguard, where I decided, well, if you're going to try and kill my bodyguards, I'm going to give those HVAs to the most Anvil unit inside the whole Anvil army, being my Forge Guard units. And if you want to come and get them, you can certainly do your best to give it a try. And then just march them straight up the middle of the table and see what he could do from there. So again, it was like, that's what I chose to put it with, because I went, well, if you're going to try and kill my bodyguards, good luck. But it's a matter of when you get to play a couple, you get to work it out. They are really important. That game with the bodyguard, Sam did put his HVAs with completely different types of units, and that was quite an interesting, different challenge of methodology between the 2 armies.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we just don't have anvils, anything like the Forge Guards. So, I mean, I absolutely take your point in terms of objective placing. I mean, I think it is going to be dependent on the matchup. You definitely don't want to be where GCPS can be drawing line of sight to you, because they can just wipe you off them. If you've designed your army where you're going to have cheap objective sitters, then absolutely you want to be hiding those objectives behind cover. If you don't have the luxury of those cheap objective sitters in your list, then I guess you are probably looking at putting them somewhere where they can still do a little bit of activity, put out a little bit of firepower at range or something, just while hopefully not copying everything from the entirety of the rest of the army.
Yeah, I mean, you can put it at the corner of a building, right? So you can walk your leader up to the corner of the building, he can sit around, and then his buddies can all hide and cower behind the building for cover, and they can still get their shots off, they can still hold the objective. And really, I think it is worthwhile, although some lists don't do it well, it is worthwhile looking for those cheap units. If you have to sit something right in the back corner for control advance, or to push onto an objective that's in cover somewhere up the field, having something that can hide is always, we spoke about the Maison Labs bikes for 40 points.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of a unit that you don't care if it does nothing else other than claim an objective for 2 rounds.
All it needs to do is live.
Yep.
Yep.
And even just a couple of turns as well.
So one of the other things with objective placement is when you place an objective, your opponent isn't able to place objectives within a 6-inch range of that.
Yeah.
Is that something you ever use proactively in order to go, well, I'm going to place here, meaning that they're then not able to place an objective. I'm screening out this area.
Not as much as in Kings of War, because it's a 12-inch range there. It's much easier to bully someone out of a zone. Here, it's a lot harder because you're already constrained to that half of the table. It's harder to bully them out of a zone, but you can a little bit. You can kind of make it a bit worse where they can place, but never really wholly zone them out.
So I guess, as I said, I don't normally get the pleasure of deploying first and holding back units. What do you guys, like, without the special units that you can have from reserve, like my Hammer Fist drop troopers, etc., what other units would you decide to hold back from your normal deployment to withhold, is the actual term, in your deployment? So
my prime targets for holding back are generally my counter units, or units that have a specific counter. So by this I mean I've taken a Chroma Force platform in order to drill an opponent's vehicle from across the board. I'm going to hold that one back until I see where their vehicle is. So that one is a specific counter unit, or conversely, it could be a vehicle which has a specific counter. Again, it's probably a vehicle. I want to see where their anti-tank batteries, or flyers, where their anti-aircraft batteries are going to be going down. I want to see where they are before I make my decision here.
Yeah, it's likewise for me. It's often counter units, and it's usually anti-tank
yeah.
units as well, or something like a bomber or a cruiser in enforcers. Also, anything that's maybe not obvious about where it's going to go. So if you're clearly putting a shooting troop on a backfield objective, like, just put it there.
Yeah.
Everyone knows it's going there. If you're putting an assault unit in a vehicle like a mule or something that's not itself getting held back, We all know where it's going. Just
going in that mule.
just put it there, right? So you lead with those things that are obvious because they're going there anyway, and you hold back the less obvious stuff.
I just, again, because I deal with a lot of new players, there's one rule that it is in the book and it's relatively plain, but it gets asked quite often. But the withholding section of it, if you're putting a unit in a transport or multiple units in a transport, that comes as a whole package. So for instance, if you want to put a unit in a transport, you need to have 1 by 2 to withhold that off the table.
Reserves too. You have to allocate what you're holding back. So if you want the decision to reserve something and you want to wait for that, that has to be one of your held back units. And then you say, that's going in reserve.
Yeah,
so it's great to call that out. It is very common.
It does say it in the rule book, but it trips up a lot of new players originally in the rules. So it's basically the one I just wanted to point out at this point.
Excellent. I like what you were saying as well about things which are not obvious. One of the things I really like for that is scouts, just because if I hold back a scout unit, I can then plonk them somewhere and then immediately advance them. I get a lot greater bang for my buck in placing that scout and then getting a free move. So scouts will often be one of my delayed deployment units as well.
I was just thinking to myself a second ago, I said, like with the Hammerfist or drop troopers, they can scout on the table. I haven't done it yet. I can see in my mind's eye a purpose where I potentially would do that. But the guns are only 12 inches. Normally when I'm doing that and we're talking about planning, I like to try to hold them off as long as possible, like the end of turn 3 of my last activation or something like that, to bring them in. Generally, if I bring them in turn 2, it's because something's going horribly wrong and I've had to bring them in to try to shore up a flank or something like that. That's not worked the way I expected it. What about you guys? So you have a plan when you normally think of bringing those type of units in? Like when you're starting off at this point?
I guess in terms of when I'm bringing in my reserves, I'm not terribly patient. I mean, they're probably coming in turn 2, but I really don't mind them coming in late in turn 2 because then more information has been revealed. I guess my choices of where to put them is wherever they're going to have most impact, and when is whenever it's going to be most disruptive to my opponent's plans. It's rare I probably hold them back to turn 3. I mean, I guess because whenever I'm making the decision to hold something with aerial or subterranean deployment in reserve, I'm always doing the weighing up pros and cons. Am I willing to sacrifice turn 1's shooting in order to have them in exactly the right place in turn 2? And often that's the case. Like Black Talons will probably put out a little bit of firepower in turn 1, but it's not going to be game changing. But being able to drop them in the exact right position turn 2 is very useful. And ditto things like skyscrapers and so on as well, just the ability to come down, unload shotguns exactly where you need them to be. If that's what I'm going for, then I'll pick that. I'm probably not waiting to turn 3 though.
Yeah, in the absence of, playing all tunneling Veerman in Scourge or Take and Hold, you're probably going to want to bring everything on earlier than the last possible moment. For me, it depends on, the mission and your opposition as well, but also whether you took that unit with that role in mind in the first place. So, for example, you're almost never going to subterranean deploy a shield tunneler. It can, but that's not why you're taking it. It's way more effective being on the table with your force and not coming up on its own somewhere else on the table. Even skyscrapers with claws like talons instead of shotguns, they're probably never going to want to come up behind someone because they have to wait a whole turn before they charge again, right? They want to be scouting. So just because it can deploy from reserve doesn't mean that you took it to do that. So that's the first point. Other than that, I think in general, don't overdo it. I think it's very easy to look at all these things that can subterranean deploy or aerial deployment and just go, yep, they're all doing that. And then you're on the back foot from turn 1. But, the right unit in reserve can cause a serious tactical issue for your opponent in the first couple of turns, popping up where they don't want one and then having to turn some of their force and deal with it.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking something like controlled advance, where they might have stuck a relatively light but long-ranged unit on one of their back objectives. Just the ability to drop down right next to them and ruin their day is pretty tough on your opponent. They either then need to redirect units back from the front line.
Something like Night Terror, chem throwers can pop up on turn 2 and take out
most things.
A unit holding an objective, and then on turn 3 they can take out the other one.
what I generally do, again, because I don't normally have the activations, I'm waiting for the opponent. If the opponent's been making an error and double activating all the time, and now the activation levels have become really close, I can then activate at the end of that turn, preferably turn 3 for me, because I like to hold them off as long as possible, because Forgefather is normally hanging around and we normally win late in the game. And then hopefully I can then land them, shoot them. The other opponent might have one more unit to activate, and then I get to assault first next turn. If I choose to go first again. So I can shoot and then move into assault and look at assaulting after that. So I can certainly see other reasons why you might want to bring them on a lot earlier than that to exert pressure, particularly, I guess, with nice squishy veermen.
All right, so we've won or lost the roll and decided what we are or aren't holding back. So then we've got to deploy the strike force in our deployment zone. How do you guys go about deciding what and where to deploy?
I mean, I guess if we assume that I'm deploying first, because if I'm deploying second, I then have all the extra information of seeing most of my opponent's deployment zone, and then that'll factor into the way I put things in. The major thing is I think back to my list building. What was my plan for my army? What things go together to sit within their nice little synergy bubbles? Like, do I have an Urbana Blackwing Marine unit right next to a lab experiment unit so I can trigger the expendables, have them blaze away, have this one move up? Great, then they're going to be paired together. Aside from that, it'll be digging into what I was talking about before with picking a deployment zone. I'm going to be looking for where my lines of advance are, where my fire lanes are. If I'm deploying first, where I'm expecting the opponent to be putting things down. We'll chat a little bit in a moment about formations. I guess the other thing is playing to the mission as well. I've already put down the objectives, and I've already got a bit of a plan for that. When I'm placing those objectives, I've probably also already got a bit of an idea which unit I'm going to be walking or sprinting up to that.
Forgefather's being slower than the wet week. You normally need to look at 2 or 3 turns in advance about where you expect to be and where you think that battle is going to start to take place, and that's where you want to make sure that you've got your units lined up to be able to get to that particular point on the battlefield. Enforcers are a little bit different, or at least the way I play them, because I generally play them quite mobile, so I can generally get to wherever I want. But particularly with Forgefathers, you have to be pretty careful about how you're deploying to make sure the objectives you think you're going to get to, that you're going to be able to get there by the end of turn 2 to turn 3, so you can start holding on to them. So you've got to look at whether or not any terrain pieces are going to be in your way, or if they're going to help you. As Luke mentioned earlier, we might be able to move into a building and get a few extra inches next turn to be able to get back out of that building to keep on going through.
With defensible on the way in order to trigger your Overwatch.
So generally, because my enforcers are normally quite mobile, I'm not so worried about it. It's more of a case of trying to hide my planes, getting shot out of the air turn 1. But my Forgefathers, I have to be a lot more premeditated and think about where they're going to be.
You know, when we first talked about doing this, I realized that I kind of more do it by feel. I know that there's some strategies that I use, but I haven't ever qualified or quantified what they are. So I had to write a few notes, and I realized I went from not feeling like I didn't have much to say to feeling like I've got a little bit too much to say. I also don't tend to find I deploy that. I mean, I don't usually lose the recon roll. I tend to like having lots of command dice, so I don't often lose it. So I am usually deploying first, but those rare times where I haven't, I don't tend to find it's affected my deployment that much. So I kind of know how my army wants to play to begin with, and I kind of deploy with that in mind, and then just playing around terrain and sort of what the scenario is.
You've already got your plan from your list building. You kind of know how everything's going to go
not
down.
necessarily how they deploy. I don't have a deployment map in my mind, but I know what units want to be near what and sort of how things work well together, particularly with my Marauders, because I've played with them quite a bit now. I know how I want the army to play out and what needs to be near what and whatnot. So, but what I typically tend to do is deploy in the center 2/3 of the board. So really from like 1/3 line to 2/3 line as you go across the table. I tend to sort of deploy mostly around there, usually in sort of 2 mainish battle group style deployments. Main reason for that is, 2 commanders can now sort of exert their control over those 2 bubble areas. And then if you've got someone like a Commando captain that has a great aura, now you can apply that to potentially, well, he can apply it to everyone because it's ridiculous, but others can sort of move one while the other to, apply their aura wherever they need to be. So that's kind of handy. And units tend to then be closer, except your far flanking units, they tend to be close enough that you can sort of almost redeploy to support one side or the other as the battle ebbs and flows, and you sort of end up controlling the center of the board quite well. When it comes to deploy what, where, that depends on a few things. Like, always have the mission in mind. You've got to make sure everything is where it needs to be at the end of turn one. Mm-hmm. So, like, turn one is the most important real turn of the game, in my mind. So turn 0 needs to, like, not screw that up. So you've got to make sure when you're deploying that the things are where they need to be so that they can then be there in turn 1 where they need to be.
Because turn 1 really starts in turn 0. Like, turn 0 is half of turn 1. I place it here in deployment and then I move in turn 1.
Exactly. You can't move to where you couldn't move because you put it somewhere silly, right? Yeah, you have to be where they need to be to begin the game. Some more things to consider: what needs to be able to shoot at what, and importantly, what unit of yours needs to be in cover or hidden. Something's getting shot on turn 1, so make sure it's the things that can either weather it or that you don't mind losing, because something will be shot. And make them pay for it if you can. So force bad shots into cover. So deploying things in cover or half hidden or whatever are a great place to put them, or that they can move there in your turn 1, and especially force them to have to come out to make those shots. If you think they're going to deploy somewhere in cover, put things so that if they want to shoot you, they have to come out of where they want to be into where's more advantageous to you. So it puts them in harm's way, and you can shoot back at them.
Mm-hmm. You've kind of covered a few thoughts. I put down a few notes around some general formations, which I think kind of speaks to different patterns of deployment, and I think you've covered a few of them there. Let me break them down and we'll see if any of these ring true to you. First of all, I've got the bullhorn. This one's, I think I probably first heard about it in the 1960s film Zulu, where they talk about... Yeah, right. Where they talk about having the chest, which is a core of your army, which is there to pin the opposing force. It's generally made up of veterans or hard-hitting units, or ones which are just able to take a little bit of punishment and puts them out to pin down the opposing force. And then on either flank, you have fast, very hard-hitting, coming in a pincer movement in order to compress the enemy army. And in the backfield, you've got a reserve force which, wherever you've been able to make a breakthrough, they then are able to respond rapidly and capitalize on that gain. I see this being a useful strategy for marauders. I mean, I'm just thinking things like grunts and stunt bots in the center, brawlers and mules on either flank, crushing in from the sides. Does that sound about like something you'd do? That
sounds pretty on the money. So I guess more normally that would be called the crescent, and then you've got the inverted crescent as well. So the crescent seeks to draw the enemy into the center so that you can flank them. Mm-hmm. And in ancient armies, that would often be fast flankers that are held behind the outskirts of the crescent, so that you come into the center, and then they, like you said, they come around and they flank and seek to envelop the enemy. Interestingly, the inverted crescent, it's the opposite. It's more like a wedge, but where the wedge center falls back, turning it into a crescent, which is kind of an interesting thought process to lure them into the middle and then sort of hold back and then come around the flanks. Definitely Marauders love that. Vermin, maybe not so much, but something that can have that solid center line and fast flankers really love that formation. Well,
I'm glad you mentioned the inverted crescent and it being a bit wedge-shaped, because the arrowhead or the wedge was the next one I had down, and that's where you basically got a very, very heavily stacked center in multiple waves of speed, whose job is to just break through and break apart the enemy force. It's got the advantages of, if they try to stack one flank, it can turn very quickly and move to address that flank that they stack. It also has the upside that it's able to generally reach most of the battlefield as it advances forward. It has the downside that most of the battlefield is able to reach it. This is something that I'll often do with Plague, where I've got leapers and mules being the absolute point of the spear. Behind them, I've got ghouls or zombies making up a bit of a mass, and then behind that, I've got all my big beasts, and it's just a big wedge driving through. It's not for the faint-hearted, because you do lose a lot of people that way.
It's interesting you say that, though, because in my experience playing against Mike and his Forge Fathers, I think he tends to play wedge with Forge Fathers. So he'll push up, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Mike, but he tends to push up sort of resilient units up through the center while minimizing how much whittling down my fast flankers that try to come around the edges and try to delay them so that they can't get into his backfield as effectively while he goes and holds the center of the board.
Absolutely.
Is that something you think you do consciously, Mike, or have I just happened to fight you in a couple of those games, or is it a normal tactic?
No, it depends upon the opponent. So I probably would do similar to what you just said in most cases. I do tend to stack my center normally with my more resilient units and then look at hoping to break you again, like the sea crashes against the rocks, and that's basically what I'm hoping for that to occur there. Why I then collapse on your flanks with everything else, or just shoot your living daylights out of your flanks until they don't exist anymore. But I also, when Sam was just talking a second ago, that said, you crescent or your bullhorns, whichever way you want to talk about it, I managed to win BrizCon using that scenario when I noticed we were playing control. And my opponent had stacked a wedge, and so I decided to fake a wedge, but I actually was always planning to take the outside quadrants, and I was prepared to let them take the middle. A wedge or bullhorns is probably the two that I would probably use, particularly with the Forge Fathers, because of the fact that I really need that. I only have a small army, it needs to support each other. I want to have overlapping regeneration spheres, and it just works for me to do that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you also mentioned about whittling away the flanks. The wedge does need to make sure that it is doing its best to not be pincered on either side and getting compressed in itself. It has to stall out the side. All right, denied flank. So this is where you are, rather than trying to hold the center, you are stacking one side of the battlefield, and you are going to get all of your points off this. You'll have maybe some holding units over here whose job it is to delay and stall and rob the opponent from being able to score on the side that you're not particularly interested in contesting, but you're trying to very heavily weight one side of the battlefield. I have a feeling we'll probably see this used a lot by enforcers. I'm keen to hear thoughts.
Yeah, so enforcers, that was entirely how I played them, actually, particularly with the sniper bikes being able to be a utilitarian piece in that kind of model, because they could deploy on the weak flank and then redeploy somewhere else, or they could just be pinning the things coming down your weak flank to hold them up. But I think pretty much exclusively that is how I played enforcers.
So typically the side that normally in the middle of the table-ish is normally, and the bit that's not normally advancing is probably going to have your harder units in. So in this case, probably potentially be your peacekeepers in your enforcer force, and then everything else, all your faster stuff tends to be on the flank. A bit like an arm of a clock, and sweep all the way around across the battlefield and get them that way. So that's normally how that particular tactic works, and that's why I don't normally use. I do use a little bit, but Forge Fathers, but not really an awful lot. It tends to be more the faster, more mobile units that tend to do that.
Yeah, it's not about putting essentially the side of the field you're giving up. It's not about putting your weak stuff over there because that's your weak flank. It's about giving them a portion of the board that you're not going to contest, but that they can't easily come down and swing down your lines or get behind your lines. That's the denied part of the denied flank. Yeah, so units like Peacekeeper, particularly Peacekeeper Defenders, are a really good unit to pin that denied flank, because it makes it very, very hard to sort of come around and cause havoc coming down the sides.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess that the reason we keep talking about it for enforcers is denied flank is an excellent one for elite armies, because it really limits the frontage you need to fight across. If you have a smaller number of units, compressing the size of the battlefront is really advantageous to you. Well, which actually is in complete contrast to the next one, which is the battle line. So this one goes potentially very wide. Sometimes you're looking for overlapping fields of fire. You're looking to spread wide in order to try and draw the enemy also into wide. One of the things which I think is often forgotten in a battle line is you really do need to have your linebackers. You need to have those units potentially behind your lines who can very rapidly respond if they ever break through. GCPS do love a battle line because they want to expand across a wide frontage. It's that they can cover it with bodies, absolutely. For mine then, with GCPS, my linebackers are probably going to be riot troopers in a mule. I don't need to have those riot troopers racing up across the field to you. I can have them sweep across from one side of the battlefield to the other, hop out and then shotgun, and then possibly charge in. Anything which is looking to be breaking through my lines. And so that's the battle line, I think, kind of the opposite play to the denied flank.
And, I think Veermen do battle line very well as well. They're another good one, like GCPS. I think that is the best way to, they're like a tricksy battle line. Looks like a battle line, but has some tricks to bring to the table. Interestingly, I think Plague do battle line very well as well, but they do more like a combination. So it can be basically a battle line that can instantly become a denied flank, or the bullhorns or anything like that with their fast units. You think about a denied flank, right? And you're saying, oh, let's give them that quarter of the table, the third of the table, or whatever. You can do that with Plague, and you just put 1 or 2 units of zombies there, right? And they just have to chew through. They're just there. It maintains the battle line. Everything pushes forward. They just got to chew through 30 zombies, And then, you can have your sort of melee line move forward, your aberrations, corruptions, plague lords spread out, your zombies, and you've got your backfield holders, which are your ghouls, and then you've got a mule or 2 with leapers in them as well, so you can instantly turn it into a flanking maneuver.
No, you're absolutely right about the denied flank with the plague. I mean, often you are just going, I've only got a small number of scoring units. I'm only going to score these objectives, and I'm just going to put them all over here. This side is all my beasts. You cannot afford to ignore them because it's aberrations and zombies and all this other stuff. You have to kill them, but all the time you're killing them, I'm making it harder for you to score.
I just want to say with the battle line, because sometimes people have the connotation that they're just going to sit back and shoot, but just reminding everybody in this particular game that the battle line is more like your World War One, moving up through the trenches and advancing under artillery fire. So you need to keep moving forward to the objectives with the battle line. It's not going to be static at the back. And just to some earlier references that was made by, I think, mainly Luke, but Sam as well, that also goes in, we're talking about fire lines, particularly with GCPS. You're looking at, if you're going to be for weapons teams there, you're going to have to make sure that you're not blocking it with all those mass pieces of infantry. So you've got to look at that and those lines. Surprisingly, the other army I've mentioned is Asterians. I generally see sometimes as a battle line as well. Quite often, that's another one that you don't think because they're more elitish, but I often see them as a battle line too.
You're absolutely right, and I was going to call them out because Asterians don't actually mind going wide. They like you spreading your shots across a large amount of their frontage, because then all you do is knock down their shields, and then their shields come back, and the line keeps moving forward. As well as they've also got some excellent linebacker units as well who can really close those gaps very well.
I do tend to find though that they're like more of a staggered line. You tend to find they're not, they can't bring that sort of that wave of bodies forward like Plague or GCPS can.
Like a checkerboard.
Yeah, exactly. More like a checkerboard, which is interesting to note.
So those are a few formations which might. Some of them might ring true to the way you play out your deployments. After you've got all of your army down, it's not quite yet time to do first activation, though often I do forget this step and then have to quickly beg my opponent's indulgence. There's scout moves. All the armies are down, scout moves happen. The obvious thing for scout moves are either going to be, these are skyscrapers or an assault-focused scout unit. I'm looking to get up the table into cover so I can hopefully charge you very early, or at least project threat so you don't want to move up. Or I'm scouting straight onto an objective turn 1 and now you need to shift me. So I guess if we think those are the obvious ones, I'd like to put on the table as well, do consider lateral movement. So you don't always need to be rocketing straight up the board. So if you're deploying first, sticking monocycles or a similar unit in the middle of your line can be really, really effective. You don't need to go straight up the board. They're fast enough for that anyway. You can then move 18 inches to either side depending on which flank you want to be putting them on. So do shift the mindset on scouts. You don't need to go up. You can go sideways and pick a side that you're wanting to be focusing on for objective scoring.
I agree. Like scouting forward for a better threat projection is all fine. For me, I really like that option of redeploying for a more efficient, turn 1. Particularly for units like Enforcer Sniper Bikes that I've mentioned a couple of times. They don't want to be engaging up close anyway. So for me, their scout is more about, here's where I'm going to put them now to maybe force you to go, to think about them over here. End of turn 0, just before we play, they're 18 inches over here now.
Can I also say the same for Enforcer Pathfinders? Because they've got a reasonable range. I think people often think, well, I just want to rock my Pathfinders straight up. Oh, they've just been assaulted and they're dead. Pathfinders aren't great. Well, what if you stick them in the center of your line, see where the enemy deploys, and then go left or right exactly where they need to be?
Or just 1 inch forward.
Sure, because then they're in shooting range.
24-inch shoot range, they can steady aim, and that's fine.
Yeah, you don't need to use all that scout.
Sometimes I like to use my Pathfinders as bait.
Yeah.
So if I want to get something, if I want to dangle it out there and hopefully they'll come and grab it, so then the rest of my units might be able to focus on taking it down. So it's a similar version to what we were saying before about a refused flank. I'll put something out there, I want you to come there, and then I'm going to just keep mowing all my firepower at that particular area, and you're not coming any further than that unit that you just took. But otherwise, it becomes quite obvious, particularly, you can do some nice tricks on... evacuate, go in there, you can scout forward. Extraction, sorry, that's the one. Yes, extraction. You can scout forward and you can pretty much be on one target already and grab it and start taking it back straight away. So
it's so good in that mission.
There, but so that's one of the obvious versions, but that's the other one. So that's basically it. So sometimes, yes, I'll dangle it out as bait, see if you take it, and then hopefully it'll draw you into a kill box and start destroying your army.
Particularly if the bait can end up in terrain as well.
Yep.
Because that -2 with the, if they've got the stealth, it's a pain to shift.
All right. I think it's about now that you then go, all right, myself or the opponent, we can now take our first activation, and that ends turn 0. Hopefully this has given you a little bit to think of in terms of all the play that happens before a unit starts moving and shooting in the game. There's a lot that goes into turn 0. It's, I feel, really where you set yourself up for success or otherwise.
So just before we get taken out, we'll go into Overwatch. So what are we looking forward to on the sci-fi horizons? Personally, nothing in particular that's coming other than being hopeful about more Vault releases, because I've been enjoying kit bashing and digital kit bashing with Blender, and I'm looking forward to do more of that. Mike?
Clash of Protocols, you mentioned it earlier, which is the big tournament that's happening in the end of January. Obviously got Christmas coming up shortly, but then that's my main planning. Very surprised and very enthusiastic about the take-up of that from the general public. Hopefully, if there's a few more people listening, please get in there and buy your tickets. I have some planning to do on what kind of terrain and tables and things like that I'm going to need to organise for that. So the earlier you get in, the easier it will be for us to do that. So please buy your tickets for that.
For myself, because it is December right now, that means we'll be coming up to 12 days of Mantic, where Mantic does all its reveals of what's going to be coming through 2025. I always await that somewhat eagerly because I'm always very excited. I know there's going to be some Epic Warpath stuff dropping this year, I'm sure, but I'm sure we'll get some very juicy things landing for Firefight and all the other games we play. So that's what's on my horizon.
And that brings us to a close. So remember to form your formations, reserve your reserves, and unleash controlled fire.
Hear the